Donald Trump has set records for making false or misleading statements both in person and on social media. Fact checkers have tracked tens of thousands of untruths throughout his campaigns and presidential terms, like this demonstrably false statement at a rally on Friday.
By the way, you know we're a three-term president. We just don't want the results. We won 3 times, but we only want the results of the first and the third. I know.
Just a reality check in case anyone needs to hear it. No, Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election. In a newly released book, Liar's Kingdom, How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America, Andrew Weissman argues that the vulnerability to lies told by politicians stems from a flaw in America's legal system, but is something he says can be fixed. Andrew Weissman, you're back with us. Talk to us about this law that you propose in your book about political falsehoods or fictitious and fraudulent statements, and whether or not you think this is a trend that is going to continue post-Trump, or if this is something that does need to be legislated.
So in terms of what I was writing about, it is the number of lies that we see from politicians and why in this country, unlike in other so-called Western countries, we don't do anything about it. We criminalize or hold for civil liability all sorts of lies. I had prosecuted the leaders of the Enron Corporation, business leaders, for lying about the state of Enron, the internal health, and those people went to jail and were civilly liable to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars. If you lie to Congress, if you lie to banks, if you lie to the Department of Justice or the FBI, all of those things are criminalized. But when it comes to politicians lying to all of us, we don't do anything about it. And again, I'm not talking about opinions. I am not talking about making mistakes. I'm talking about if you intentionally lie. Rudy Giuliani was held to account for intentionally lying about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, as was found by a judge and jury. So there are all sorts of contexts where we hold people to account for saying something that is intentionally false. But when Donald Trump says there was, material fraud in the 2020 election, as you just said, Jackie, that is not true, but there are no legal repercussions. And that is different than what happens in, for instance, England or Brazil. And I look at what other foreign countries have done to try and deter people who lie to us.
Can I just add quickly, though, there are not just no legal repercussions. There are the top election deniers who are now official parts of the U.S. federal government. People like Kurt Olson, who is a top official at ODNI, pursuing and continuing these investigations into voting machines and the 2020 election. Eugene, sorry to interrupt.
No. And you even saw Tina Peters, who got a nice, cushy commutation in her tweets right after, saying more lies about what happened in 2020. I do wonder, and I think a lot of people are wondering, Andrew, how do you get around the First Amendment, right? You mentioned some of those other countries. Like, we have the First Amendment, the point is that people are allowed to kind of say what they want, especially in the political sphere. So how do you get around that in your argument?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about the First Amendment, but let me give you an example. We are all on the air now, and we work for MS Now, and that is, responsible journalism. It's true for all sorts of responsible journalistic outlets, whether right, left, or center. And one of the things that we have and other such outlets have is a standards group, and they look to make sure that what we are saying is truthful, is accurate, it is supported when we are making factual representations as opposed to opinions. And one of the things they're doing is they're doing that not just for those reasons, but they don't want us to get sued. They are saying we don't want to have the defamation laws come into effect because of something we said that's inaccurate. And we don't say, wait a second, that's a violation of the First Amendment. We don't say it's a violation of the First Amendment when we hold Enron officials to account for saying something that's intentionally, factually false about Enron, or the same thing when you testify before Congress. So there are all sorts of circumstances where false factual statements, when they're proved after due process, we don't say, don't worry, they're protected by the First Amendment. And I feel like as journalists, we're very aware of that.
Andrew, real quickly, because we are out of time, but I do wonder if one of the solutions is we call a thing. And instead of saying that they prevaricated, they told untruths, they delivered falsehoods, they what they said was fictitious. Why don't we do what you do in your title and call them flat out lies? Wouldn't that help?
Look, I absolutely agree that it is something that when you, obviously there has to be the proof, the facts that show that. But if that's the case, using euphemisms doesn't help. And two-sidesisms, to sort of saying, well, there's two sides to that story, doesn't help when there are not two sides to that story. Right. I couldn't agree with you more.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you very much for coming to The Weekend. The new book is titled, your new book is titled Liar's Kingdom, How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America.